Here's the thing nobody tells you about getting fired. It's not the meeting that breaks you. It's the Tuesday after, when you still wake up at 6:40 out of pure muscle memory, put on real pants, and then remember you have nowhere to put them. So on the Tuesday in question, I did what I'd done every morning for the past year and a half. I made 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, grabbed the newspaper off my own porch because Frank Whitaker refuses to believe local news exists on a phone, and walked the 11 steps between our front doors like it was still a commute I had a reason to make. I knocked twice, said, "Delivery for one grumpy old man," a joke that stopped being funny around the 400th time I made it, and waited for the sound of his cane against the hardwood. The door opened. It was not Frank. It was the woman who, 31 days earlier, had sat across a conference table from me in a blazer that cost more than my car payment, and explained, in the gentlest voice she could manage, that my position was being restructured out of existence, effective immediately. Same voice, same composure, same face I'd spent a month trying very hard not to think about, and failing, because apparently my brain files unemployment trauma and unresolved eye contact in the exact same drawer. I stood there holding 2 coffees and a newspaper like the world's saddest delivery service, and she looked just as blindsided as I felt, which was somehow worse, because I'd at least had 11 steps to prepare. "You," she said. "Me," I agreed, since that seemed to be where my vocabulary had landed. Let me back up, because you deserve context before you watch 2 grown women short-circuit on a welcome mat. 4 weeks before this, I had a title, a salary, and a 5-year-old named Ruby, who thought I hung the moon because I could make grilled cheese into shapes. Then the company I'd given 6 years to decided a spreadsheet mattered more than the people on it, and a woman named Camille Calloway, new CEO, brought in to streamline, which is corporate for cut until it bleeds, signed off on the restructuring that ended with my badge deactivated before I'd even cleaned out my desk. I won't pretend I handled it with grace. I cried in a Target parking lot. I ate an entire sleeve of crackers standing at my kitchen counter at 11 p.m. like a raccoon with severance anxiety. And every morning since, the one thing that still made sense was walking next door with 2 coffees for a 78-year-old widower who complained about my coffee, my parking, and my taste in music, and who I would, without question, take a bullet for. If you're the kind of person who needs a reason to stick around for a story, and honestly, who isn't, stick around for this one, because I promise it gets so much messier before it gets good. I'm going to tell you exactly how a woman who fired me ended up, somehow, opening the one door in my life that still felt safe. Hit subscribe, because where this goes next, you will not see coming. Tell me in the comments, have you ever run into the absolute last person you expected, standing exactly where you didn't expect them? Because Camille Calloway, CEO, corporate hatchet in human form, was standing in Frank Whitaker's doorway in sweatpants and a Cubs t-shirt, holding his reading glasses like she'd been about to bring them to him. "He's my grandfather," she said, before I could ask the question written all over my face. "I didn't know you lived. I didn't know this was your Frank." "He's not my Frank," I said. "He's everyone's Frank. He's a public utility at this point." Somewhere behind her, muffled, Frank's voice carried down the hallway. "Is that my coffee? Tell whoever's out there I don't do decaf and I don't do drama." Too late, Frank. Too late for both of us, honestly, though neither of us knew yet just how late. She shifted her weight in the doorway, glasses still dangling from her fingers, and for one long, ridiculous second, neither of us said anything at all, just stood there, absorbing the sheer inconvenience of the universe's timing. "I should probably let you in," she finally said, stepping back from the door like she wasn't entirely sure of the etiquette here. "He's expecting his coffee. Apparently that's non-negotiable." "It really isn't," I said, and stepped past her into the one house on this street where I'd never once felt like a stranger, suddenly unsure whether that would still be true tomorrow. I want you to understand something before we go any further, because I think it matters for everything that comes after. I did not, in that moment, feel anything close to hope. I felt ambushed. I felt like the universe had taken the one steady thing left in my week and quietly rewired it while I wasn't looking. And I resented her a little for it. Even though none of this was technically her fault, that resentment would not last. But it was real that morning, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to make the story prettier than it was. People assume single motherhood is the hard part. It's not. Not really. Ruby is 5. She thinks the moon follows our car on purpose. And most days she's the only thing keeping my nervous system from filing for divorce from my own body. The hard part is the math. The math is always the hard part. 6 years at that company had built a life with exactly 0 margin for error, which is a polite way of saying that losing my job didn't just cost me a paycheck. It cost me the illusion that I had any cushion at all. I picked up freelance bookkeeping gigs off a job board that mostly seemed to want 22-year-olds who'd work for exposure. I sold a treadmill I never used. I became disturbingly skilled at making one rotisserie chicken stretch across 4 different dinners, a skill nobody puts on a resume but should. And every morning, before the freelance emails, before Ruby woke up asking for pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, there was Frank, steady as the sunrise, complaining about something new every single day. It started small. He'd lost his wife, Eleanor, 2 years before I moved in. And the first week I lived next door, I noticed he hadn't brought his trash cans up from the curb in 3 days. I brought them up myself, knocked to tell him, and got a lecture about how he was perfectly capable, delivered by a man leaning so hard on his porch railing I thought it might give out under him. He was not perfectly capable. Not entirely. But he was proud, and grief does strange things to pride, so I didn't push. I just started bringing the paper with the trash cans, then coffee with the paper. Somewhere in there, without either of us naming it, I became the person he complained to about his physical therapist, and he became the person who noticed, every single time, when I hadn't slept. "You've got the face," he told me once, not looking up from his crossword. "The one that says you're doing math you don't like." I hadn't told him about the layoff yet. I told him that morning instead. I sat on his porch steps while Ruby chalk drew a lopsided cat on his sidewalk, and I expected sympathy, or worse, pity. What I got was Frank grunting, unimpressed, and saying, "Companies are cowards. Always have been. You'll land." Then he handed me half his crossword and told me to earn my coffee. That's the version of comfort I understand. Not soft, not a hug and a platitude. Just somebody who shows up, hands you a puzzle, and refuses to treat you like you're breakable. So when his granddaughter opened his door in a Cubs t-shirt 31 days after signing my termination paperwork, it wasn't just awkward. It felt like watching 2 entirely separate rooms in my life get shoved into one without my permission, without so much as a knock first. I found out over the next 10 minutes, delivered in fragments, because Frank kept interrupting to ask if anyone was going to bring him his actual coffee. The shape of what had happened while I wasn't paying attention to his side of the fence. Camille had taken a leave from the company to help him recover from a fall he'd had 3 weeks earlier, the one he'd downplayed to me as a little stumble, nothing to fuss over, which now explained the new cane, the visiting physical therapist twice a week, and the granddaughter apparently moving in for the foreseeable future. I felt something shift in my chest. Some careful architecture I'd built around my own recovery quietly buckling under a fact I hadn't accounted for. Frank, for his part, looked delighted by the tension in the room, in the specific way that only a nosy 78-year-old widower can look delighted. "Well," he said, easing himself into his armchair like a king surveying a court he'd built on purpose. "This is going to be interesting." I did not think interesting was the word I would have chosen. Not with 2 coffees going cold in my hands, and a woman I'd built an entire villain narrative around standing 3 feet away in someone else's kitchen. "You should probably sit," Camille said, gesturing at the chair across from Frank's. Her voice carrying none of the boardroom polish it had the last time she'd used it on me. This is clearly going to take longer than either of us planned for this morning. I sat, because my legs had apparently already decided that for me, and because some traitorous part of my brain wanted to know exactly how long this particular morning was going to last. We didn't talk about the layoff that first day, not directly. We talked about Frank's exercises, his medication schedule, the home aide he'd already tried to fire once. It was logistics dressed up as conversation, careful and deliberately shallow. Both of us circling the one topic sitting in the room like a third person neither of us had invited. I left an hour later than I meant to, coffee stone cold, with absolutely no idea what I'd just started.
Hi, it's Lena Pham. A quick reminder before we continue. If you like light romance stories with more depth and development than what fits in the videos here on the channel, on my Patreon, there's a complete library of exclusive stories you won't find anywhere else. These are different stories with more room to explore the characters and their feelings. The link is in the description. Now, back to the story.
Frank did not let it go. Frank, I would learn very quickly, did not let anything go. You two know each other, he said. Not a question. The way a man says something he already knows just to watch what happens to your face when you have to confirm it. We work together, Camille said. At the exact moment I said, she fired me. Frank's eyebrows went up somewhere near his hairline. Well, that's a hell of a first sentence for a reunion, he said, delighted with himself in a way that made me want to throw a couch cushion at him. I want to tell you I handled the next part with composure. I did not. I stood in that doorway, still holding 2 cups of coffee that were rapidly losing the will to be warm, and said something along the lines of, Ruby's probably up, which was true, and also the fastest exit line available to a woman who needed to not be in that hallway for 1 more second. Camille caught the door before I could fully turn away. For what it's worth, she said, low enough that Frank, deep in his armchair complaining about his cane, wouldn't catch it. I didn't enjoy that meeting. Neither did I said, but only one of us got to keep her job after it. I left before she could answer, which felt, at the time, like winning. It did not feel like winning by that afternoon, when I sat on my own porch steps watching Ruby ride her scooter in aggressive figure 8s. I found myself replaying the exact tone of Camille's voice instead of doing the invoice I owed a client by 5. I am not proud of this. I am telling you anyway, because if I'm going to be honest with you about anything, it should be the parts that make me look ridiculous. Here is what I knew about Camille Calloway, professionally. She'd been brought in 8 months earlier from outside the company, promoted fast, tasked with cutting costs, after 2 rough quarters. She had a reputation, deserved in my case, for delivering bad news in a calm, almost gentle voice that somehow made it worse, because you couldn't even be angry at her tone without feeling a little unreasonable for it. Here's what I knew about her now, personally, as of that morning. She wore sweatpants around her grandfather's house. She looked exhausted in a way spreadsheets don't cause. And she had, for 1 full second in that doorway, looked at me like she was bracing for something she deserved. I hated that I noticed that. I hated it more than I hated the severance package, which is really saying something, because that severance package had cost me actual, quantifiable sleep. That evening, Frank actually called on the landline he refuses to give up, supposedly to complain that Camille had rearranged his spice rack. But really, I suspected, to fish for information he had no legitimate right to. She's not so bad, he said, entirely unprompted, in the tone of a man laying groundwork he thought was subtle. Bit stiff. Works too much. Reminds me of someone. Who? I asked, already regretting the question. You, he said, and hung up before I could tell him that was, objectively, the worst possible thing he could have said to a woman actively trying not to think about someone. I sat with the phone still in my hand for a long minute after that, staring at the wall like it owed me an explanation. Frank had a way of landing exactly the sentence you didn't want. wrapped in exactly enough affection that you couldn't be properly angry about it. I put Ruby to bed, did the dishes, and lay awake longer than I cared to admit, running an inventory of every small, unwanted thing I'd noticed about a woman I was supposed to still be furious with. By the time I actually fell asleep, I'd built and dismantled at least 4 separate arguments for why none of this meant anything, and believed exactly none of them, which felt like its own kind of verdict, delivered by nobody but myself, in the dark, at an hour when self-deception gets a lot harder to maintain. 3 days went by before I had to face her again, which is a very long time when your neighbor's driveway shares a fence line with yours and your daughter has decided the neighbor's granddaughter has a nice car and cool boots and must be greeted personally every time she appears. "Miss Camille," Ruby yelled from her scooter, at a volume that suggested Miss Camille was somehow hard of hearing rather than just 20 feet away. "Grandpa Frank says you make bad coffee." "Grandpa Frank," Camille called back, "says a lot of things." Ruby considered this diplomatic non-answer, decided it was acceptable, and returned to her figure eights, entirely satisfied with the exchange. I stood by our shared fence with a watering can I did not actually need, because I'd seen Camille come outside, and some deeply unwise part of my brain had decided this was an opportunity rather than a threat worth avoiding. "He's not wrong, for the record," I said, "about the coffee." "I make excellent coffee," Camille said. "I make it exactly the way the machine's manual tells me to, which apparently offends him on a personal level. You can't measure Frank's coffee. You have to feel it." "Is that a metaphor?" "No," I said. "It's a warning. He'll send it back, and he will make sure you know exactly why." She almost smiled. I watched her almost do it, watched her catch herself doing it, and felt an entirely unreasonable spike of satisfaction, like I'd won something small and pointless, and was going to enjoy it anyway, regardless of how petty that made me. We talked for longer than either of us probably intended to, about Frank's stubbornness regarding his physical therapy exercises, about the fact that he'd apparently tried to fire his home health aide twice in 1 week for excessive cheerfulness, about nothing important at all, which was somehow the strangest part of the whole conversation. It didn't feel like talking to the woman who'd ended my employment in a beige conference room. It felt like talking to someone easy to talk to, which was deeply inconvenient, given the narrative I'd built. "I keep waiting for you to bring it up," she said eventually, watching Ruby loop past us for the 4th time, scooter wheels grinding against the pavement. "Bring what up?" "The layoff. You've had every opportunity, and you keep not taking it." "I'm saving it," I said, "for when I need the leverage." That got the smile all the way out, quick and surprised, like it had escaped before she'd approved it, and it did something unfair to her whole face, softened something that had looked carved out of granite a month ago. "For what it's worth," she said again. She seemed to like that phrase, seemed to use it as a door she opened part way and then stood in the gap of, "The restructuring wasn't my idea. I inherited the mandate. I just had to be the one who delivered it, because that's apparently what the job requires of a person." That's a very corporate way of saying, "not my fault." It's the truth, though. Doesn't make it less true just because it's convenient for me. I didn't have an answer for that. Not one that didn't require admitting I'd already half believed her, based on nothing but a doorway and a Cubs t-shirt, and the exhausted way she talked about her grandfather, like he was the only thing keeping her honest lately. Ruby saved me from having to find one by crashing her scooter directly into my shin, hard enough that I yelped, and by the time I'd finished making sure she hadn't broken anything, Camille had already started laughing at the two of us. "Are you two always like this?" she asked, watching Ruby announce, with the total confidence of a 5-year-old, that the crash had been the scooter's fault entirely. "Every single day," I said. "It's a miracle I have any shins left." Camille crouched down to Ruby's level, asked her with total seriousness whether the scooter needed to be disciplined, and Ruby, delighted beyond words, launched into an elaborate explanation of scooter justice that had absolutely no internal logic and held both our full attention anyway. By the time Camille finally stood back up, brushing grass off her knees, Something in the afternoon had loosened between us. Some tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying since the doorway a week before. "I should get back," she said, though she didn't move right away. "He'll want his dinner started." "Tell him I said his spice rack days are numbered," I said. And she laughed again, and the sound of it followed me back inside the house longer than I wanted to admit. The conversation ended exactly where conversations like that always seem to end, unfinished, and somehow louder for it, echoing in my head well after her car door had shut and her taillights had disappeared around the corner. I stood at my kitchen sink washing dishes I didn't need washed yet, replaying half a dozen small moments from the last hour, and understood, with a kind of dread I hadn't expected, that I liked this woman considerably more than my pride wanted to admit. Frank's fall, it turned out, had been worse than a little stumble. I learned this the way I learned most true things about Frank, sideways, through someone else, because he'd rather chew glass than admit vulnerability directly to the person actually asking. Camille told me on a Thursday, sitting on the top step of his porch while he napped inside with the television turned up loud enough to double as a smoke detector. He'd broken his hip in September, she said, been in rehab for 6 weeks, and had been downplaying his recovery to everyone. "So you took leave," I said, "from the CEO job." "I took leave," as she confirmed. The board wasn't thrilled. Apparently there's no elegant way to tell shareholders your CEO is taking 3 months off to make sure her grandfather does his hip exercises properly. "Poor shareholders," I said, mostly to see if she'd take the bait. "I know how that sounds." "No," I said, and meant it. "It sounds like the first genuinely likable thing I've learned about you since this whole mess started." She looked at me sideways, like she was deciding whether that was an insult wearing a compliment's coat. And I let her sit with the ambiguity, because honestly, so was I. The proximity became a fact of life fast after that conversation. Frank needed groceries carried, appointments driven to, exercises supervised by someone patient enough not to let him quit after 4 reps. And somehow, without either of us formally agreeing to it, Camille and I fell into a quiet, unspoken rotation. She had the mornings, since she wasn't due back at the office remotely until 10. I had the late afternoons, since freelance bookkeeping let me set my own hours, badly, but flexibly enough to make it work. We started leaving notes on his kitchen counter. He skipped the leg lifts again. Make him eat something before the pills. Practical, functional, entirely deniable as anything other than logistics between 2 responsible adults managing one stubborn man's recovery. Except logistics don't usually make you check your phone 40 times before dinner to see if someone's replied to a note about hip exercises, and I noticed with some alarm that mine had started doing exactly that. I noticed things I had no business noticing about her at all. That she made Frank laugh in a completely different register than I did. Quieter, drier, like they shared a private frequency built over years I hadn't been part of. That she was terrible at small talk with Ruby and visibly trying, asking her overly formal questions like, "What is your opinion of the color yellow?" that somehow delighted my 5-year-old more than actual practiced warmth would have managed. That she still wore the exhaustion of the layoff meeting sometimes, in flashes, like it cost her more than she'd let on that day, more than her calm voice had ever suggested it did. I told myself this was proximity doing what proximity does. Manufacturing familiarity out of shared chores, nothing more. Nothing worth examining too closely. I told myself this every single day for 2 weeks, with decreasing success, while a woman who had once ended my career started very quietly, becoming the person I looked forward to seeing most in an otherwise uncertain week. It was an inconvenient thing to admit, even privately, even just to myself at midnight. "You're doing the thing again," Frank said to me one afternoon, apropos of nothing, while Camille was inside on a call, his voice pitched low like he was sharing state secrets. "What thing?" "The face," he said. "Different math this time, though. Older math. The kind you can't solve with a spreadsheet no matter how good you were at your old job." I didn't ask him to clarify, because I already knew exactly which math he meant, down to the decimal. I went home that evening and sat on my own porch, long after Ruby was asleep. Watching the light in Frank's kitchen window flick on and off as Camille moved through her evening routine next door, and let myself think, for the first time honestly, about what it might mean if the math Frank kept referencing actually added up to something. It was a frightening kind of arithmetic. It was also, I was beginning to suspect, the first equation in months I actually wanted to solve. I didn't have an answer that night, not one I trusted enough to say out loud, even to myself, even in the privacy of my own dark porch with nobody around to hear me admit it. But I noticed, packing up my thoughts for bed, that the dread I expected to feel about the whole situation hadn't shown up. In its place was something quieter, more curious, almost hopeful. And that absence scared me more than the dread would have, because it meant some part of me had already decided this was worth the risk. The trouble with Frank's spice rack incident is that it was never actually about the spice rack. It started because Camille, in a fit of what she called organization, and Frank called sabotage, alphabetized his entire kitchen while he was at physical therapy. And Frank came home to find his cumin where his cinnamon used to live, and declared, with the gravity of a man announcing a national emergency, that his home had been invaded by hostile forces while he wasn't looking. "I can't find anything," he told me over the fence. Scandalized, Kane pointed at his own kitchen window like it had personally betrayed him after decades of loyal service. 40 years I've had that rack in chaos, and I knew exactly where everything was. Chaos. But my chaos. And nobody asked me if they could fix what wasn't broken. "I'll talk to her," I said, which is how I ended up standing in Frank's kitchen an hour later, watching a very determined woman defend her filing system. Camille Calloway, CEO, corporate restructurer, woman who could apparently fire 400 people without raising her voice, was glaring at a spice rack like it had personally wronged her professional judgment. "He can't find the paprika," I reported, doing my best impression of a diplomat. This is apparently a 5-alarm situation in his world. "The paprika is exactly where paprika should be, alphabetically, between oregano and rosemary, the way any rational kitchen would organize it. Camille. He's had a system for 40 years, one that worked for him long before either of us showed up to fix it. His system was chaos. His system worked for him, which is the entire point of a system, functionally speaking." She turned to look at me, hands on her hips, hair coming loose from whatever knot she'd twisted it into that morning, and for one absurd second we just stood there, at a full stalemate over seasoning, in a kitchen that smelled like cumin and betrayal. Then she laughed. Actually laughed, head back, unguarded in a way I hadn't seen from her yet. And it undid something in the room, some tightness that had been sitting between us since the doorway weeks earlier. "I fixed a spreadsheet problem with kitchen logic," she said, wiping her eyes, still laughing at her own audacity. "I have never in my life felt more useless than I do right now, defending an alphabetized spice rack to you of all people. You could just admit defeat, you know. It's allowed." "I don't do that." "I've noticed," I said. "It's a very specific personality trait you and my daughter's Scooter have in common. Neither of you believe in breaks. Ever. Under any circumstances." She laughed again, harder this time, and I laughed too, and somewhere behind us Frank shuffled in, took one look at the two of us doubled over near his spice rack, and delivered his verdict with total deadpan seriousness. "I see we've solved world hunger in here," he said, which made us both laugh harder, which made him look far too pleased with himself for a man who'd started this whole thing in genuine righteous outrage 20 minutes earlier. We put his kitchen back the way he liked it after that, restoring the beautiful chaos he'd built over 40 years of marriage and widowhood alike, one jar at a time, with Camille muttering the whole time about structurally inferior systems. It took 20 minutes, and for 20 minutes, nobody mentioned severance packages or restructuring mandates or conference rooms at all. And it was, without exaggeration, one of the easiest afternoons I'd had in 2 months. Cumin and Cinnamon and Frank narrating our progress from his armchair like a satisfied director watching his cast finally get the scene right. "Thank you," Camille said quietly. Once Frank had wandered off satisfied, Cumin restored to its rightful, illogical place. For coming to referee that whole mess. Thank Frank, I said. He called me in like backup, like this was some kind of tactical operation. I meant, she said, for not making it weirder than it needed to be, between us, given everything. I didn't have a clever answer for that one. For once I just let it sit there, uncomplicated, and went home before I could ruin it by overthinking it in front of her instead of just in front of myself, which had become my new full-time hobby lately. Walking back across the 11 steps that separated our 2 front doors, I caught myself smiling at nothing in particular, replaying the sound of her laugh instead of thinking about the invoice still sitting unfinished on my kitchen table. It was a small, ordinary afternoon by most measures. A spice rack, a stubborn old man, 20 minutes of bickering that turned into laughing. And yet it sat with me all evening like something worth remembering, filed away carefully in a place I wasn't ready to examine too closely just yet. She told me about the meeting on a night I wasn't expecting to hear about it at all. Ruby had a fever, low grade, but enough to make her clingy, and I'd texted Camille to cancel our usual overlap at Frank's. Nothing serious, just a heads up, the kind of practical message we'd been trading for weeks. She showed up anyway, 20 minutes later, with a container of soup she claimed was just extra from something she'd made for Frank, and a coloring book for Ruby that had clearly been purchased that afternoon. Price tag still curled in the bag. You didn't have to do this, I said. At the door, Ruby already half asleep against my shoulder, warm and heavy the way sick kids get right before the fever finally breaks. I know, she said. I wanted to. She stayed for 20 minutes, sitting stiffly on my couch like someone unused to being in other people's living rooms. And somewhere in that 20 minutes, with Ruby drowsing on the armchair and the television playing something neither of us was watching, she told me about the meeting. Not the sanitized version. The real one. The one she'd apparently been carrying alone for over a month without telling a single soul. I fought for your position, she said, quiet, looking at the muted television instead of at me, like she needed somewhere else to put her eyes to get the words out. Not hard enough, clearly, since you're sitting here instead of at that desk. But I fought. The board wanted a bigger cut than I gave them, and I talked them down twice. And both times I told myself that was enough, that I'd done my part, and then the third time I just... She stopped, restarted. I signed it. I told myself it was the job. I told myself somebody else would have done it colder if I hadn't. And then I went home and didn't sleep. And I've been telling myself a version of that story for a month. And it's still not true enough to make it feel like nothing at all. I didn't say anything right away. I'd spent a month building a very tidy story where she was simply the woman who fired me, efficient and untouched by it. And it turned out that story had been wrong the entire time, in a way that was somehow harder to sit with than if she'd just been the villain I'd wanted her to be so badly. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, genuinely wanting to know the answer. Because you keep bringing him coffee he complains about, she said, and letting your kid ride figure eights past my car and being kind to me in a kitchen full of alphabetized spices, and I don't know how to keep accepting that from someone I hurt without at least being honest about the fact that I did. You didn't hurt me on purpose. That doesn't unhurt it, she said simply, and she wasn't wrong about that either. She was right, and it surprised me how much it settled something in my chest to hear her say it plainly, instead of dress it in corporate language, the way she dressed everything else that terrible day in the conference room. Not because it fixed the month of crackers at midnight panic, but because it meant she'd carried it too, quietly, the way I'd carried the layoff, and there was something almost unbearably tender about two people admitting they'd both been bracing for a blow neither of them wanted to land on the other. For what it's worth, I said, echoing her own phrase back at her gently, I don't think you're cold. I think you're someone who learned to look cold because it was easier than looking like this. She looked at me for a long moment, like she wasn't sure what to do with being seen that clearly by someone she'd spent a month bracing to be hated by. Someone with every reason in the world to keep hating her and choosing, instead, not to. "That's dangerously close to a nice thing to say to me," she said finally, something like relief cracking through the careful composure she'd walked in with. "Don't get used to it," I said. "I'm still deciding how I feel about you." It wasn't entirely true anymore, but it wasn't entirely a lie either. And for that night, in a living room with a sleeping kid and cooling soup, it was close enough to honest that neither of us pushed for more than that. She left a little after 10, pausing at the door to check on Ruby one more time, unnecessarily. The way you do when you've started caring about a kid who isn't yours yet but might be someday. I locked the door behind her and stood in my quiet living room for a long moment, soup going cold on the counter, and thought about how strange it was that the person who'd once ended my career now felt like one of the safest people I had left to talk to. The email arrived on a Wednesday, and it should have felt like good news, and for about 4 minutes, it did. A former colleague forwarded me a job listing, a director-level operations role, better pay than my old one, at a company 2 towns over. I read it twice, let myself feel the first real flicker of hope I'd had in 2 months, and then made the mistake of mentioning it to Frank, who mentioned it to Camille, who showed up at my door that evening looking rehearsed. "That role reports up through a board member who used to sit on ours," she said. "I know him. I could make a call if you wanted. It might help move things along." I felt something in me go very still and very cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the evening air settling in around us. "You want to fix this for me?" I said. "The way you fixed the spice rack, except with my entire career this time." "That's not..." "Because here's the thing, Camille. I spent a month rebuilding an entire version of my life without that job, without that company, without you in it at all, and I did that on my own. I don't need you to make a phone call to make yourself feel better about September." "That's not what this is. Isn't it? A little bit, at least, if you're honest with yourself about it?" She didn't answer right away, which told me more than a denial would have, and something old and defensive reared up in me. The same instinct that had kept me upright through a Target parking lot breakdown and a sleeve of crackers at midnight. The instinct that says if you let someone else fix it, you admit you couldn't manage on your own. "I don't want to be your redemption arc," I said. Quieter now, but no less firm about it. "I don't want to be the thing you feel better about once you've helped me back into a job. I stopped, because I genuinely didn't know how to finish that sentence in a way that didn't terrify me more than the layoff had. "What do you want?" she asked, and there was nothing performative in it. No boardroom composure, just a plain question from someone who actually wanted the real answer, whatever it turned out to be. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I know it's not a favor." She nodded slowly, and for a second I thought that would be the end of it. A clean, sad little ending to something that had never quite had a name to begin with. Instead, she said, "Okay. No call. I'm sorry I offered it like that. Like a transaction. That was old habit, not..." She gestured vaguely at the porch, at the space between us, at whatever this had become. "Not this," she finished, quieter, like she was still learning the shape of the sentence herself. "What is this?" I asked, and I hated how much my voice shook on it, betraying more than I wanted to give away that evening. "I don't know that either," she said, "but I'd like the chance to find out without it being complicated by me trying to buy my way out of guilt every time things get uncomfortable between us." I wanted to believe her. Some stubborn, bruised part of me wasn't ready to yet, and I told her as much, plainly, without softening it for her comfort. She took it. Didn't argue, didn't push, just nodded and said she understood, and left. And I stood on my porch for a long time after her car pulled away, furious at both of us for making something that should have been simple this hard, and quietly aware the fury wasn't really about the job. I applied for the position on my own that night, wrote my own cover letter, sent it from my own account with no calls made on my behalf by anyone, and felt, typing the last line, a strange and stubborn kind of pride that had nothing to do with her offer, and everything to do with proving to myself I still could. Whatever happened next between us, I decided, would happen on ground I'd built myself, not ground handed to me by someone trying to outrun her own guilt. I didn't hear from Camille for 4 days after that, and I told myself I was fine with the silence, that it was exactly what I'd asked for by drawing the line so firmly on my own porch. I was not, in fact, fine with it, though I refused to admit that to anyone, including Frank, who watched me not mention her name with the amused patience of a man who'd clearly seen this particular stubbornness before, in someone else, a long time ago. We didn't fight again after that. We just stopped. Quietly. The way two people do, when neither one knows how to walk back a wound without reopening it further in the process. I still brought Frank his coffee every morning. Camille still handled his physical therapy schedule, and his stubborn refusal to eat vegetables that weren't disguised as something else entirely. We orbited the same 78-year-old man for 8 days without really speaking to each other, polite in the brittle way of people who used to be easy together. Frank noticed. Of course Frank noticed. Frank notices everything, and announces roughly a third of it, at volume, at the worst possible moments, with no regard for anyone's dignity. "You two are being ridiculous," he informed me, over a crossword I wasn't actually helping with, his tone somewhere between exasperated and entertained. "I'm an old man with a bad hip, not blind." "I don't know what you mean," I said, unconvincingly, staring hard at a clue I already knew the answer to. "You know exactly what I mean. You've got the face again. She's got a version of it too, though hers is worse, because she thinks nobody can tell when she's miserable. I could always tell when Eleanor was miserable. Best skill I ever had, and I'm not about to let it go rusty just because you two want to be stubborn at each other. Frank." "I'm not going to meddle," he said, which was, historically, the exact sentence Frank used directly before meddling with full force. "I'm just going to say one thing, and then I'm going back to my puzzle. Eleanor and I had 31 years. You know how many of those years I spent scared to say the true thing because I thought it'd cost me something? 4. 4 years. Wasted. Being careful with each other when we should have just been honest. I don't have 31 years left to be careful with anymore," he added. "And neither do either of you, though you're both too young and too stubborn to believe that yet." I didn't have an answer for that, and he didn't wait for one, just went back to his crossword, muttering something about 7-letter words for stubborn, which felt less like a genuine puzzle clue and more like a pointed one aimed directly at me. That night, unable to sleep, I did something I hadn't let myself do in 8 full days. I actually thought it through, honestly, instead of just defending my bruised pride against the whole situation. Camille hadn't tried to buy me a job to erase her guilt. She'd tried clumsily, in the only language she'd been trained in for 8 months as CEO. Fixing things, solving for the variable, making the discomfort go away through action, instead of sitting with it the way the rest of us have to. It was a flawed instinct. It wasn't a cruel one. And I'd met it with the exact same defensiveness I'd built to survive the layoff. The defensiveness that says don't let anyone close enough to disappoint you twice. I thought about the doorway, the Cubs t-shirt, the laugh over the spice rack, unguarded and real, the one that had undone something in me before I was ready for it to. The quiet confession on my couch about the meeting she still hadn't forgiven herself for, delivered with no polish left on it at all. None of that was a woman performing redemption. That was just a woman, complicated and trying, the same as me, doing her best with a set of instincts she hadn't quite learned to trust yet. Somewhere around 1 a.m, I admitted to myself, fully and without qualification, that I missed her. Not the idea of her. Her. The actual specific, alphabetizing, over-formal with 5-year-olds, terrible at apologies version of her that had somehow become the person I most wanted to talk to at the end of a long day. It was an unsettling thing to admit, lying awake in the dark, but it was also, finally, the truth I'd been avoiding. I fell asleep before I figured out what to do about that, which felt, honestly, like the most on-brand ending to the day I could have written myself, and I woke up the next morning already rehearsing what I might say to her if I ever worked up the nerve to walk those 11 steps again, with something other than coffee in my hands. I spent the whole next day distracted, half-drafting sentences in my head between invoices, discarding every version as either too much or not nearly enough. And by the time evening rolled around, I still hadn't landed on anything I trusted myself to say out loud without my voice giving me away. Ruby asked twice why I kept staring out the kitchen window instead of finishing her dinosaur pancakes, and I didn't have an honest answer for her either. Not one a 5-year-old would understand yet. I found her on Frank's porch the next evening, alone. Frank already asleep inside by 9 like he'd taken to doing since his hip started improving. And I almost turned back twice before I made myself walk the 11 steps that had started this whole complicated mess in the first place. "Hey," I said, which was not the speech I'd rehearsed for 2 full days, but was apparently all that came out of me when it mattered. She looked up, surprised, guarded in that specific way she got when she expected to be hurt again by whatever came next. "Hey. Frank thinks we're being ridiculous," I said, sitting down before I could talk myself out of it. "Frank's not wrong." "No," I admitted. "He's not, and I've had 2 days to sit with that fact." I sat down next to her on the step, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. For a moment, neither of us said anything, just watched the streetlights flicker on one by one down the block. The ordinary hush of a neighborhood settling into evening around us like nothing at all was at stake. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told me finally. "About not wanting to be a redemption arc. I keep replaying it, and I think you were right to say it. And I think I've spent 8 months as CEO learning to fix problems instead of sit with them. You weren't a problem, and I treated you like one, and I'm sorry for that, more than I've known how to say properly until right now." "I've been thinking too," I said, "about the fact that I met a clumsy, well-meaning gesture with 8 days of silent treatment, because it was easier than admitting I was scared of something much bigger than a job offer." "Scared of what?" she asked, and the question landed soft, without any pressure behind it. I looked at her. Really looked. The way I'd been avoiding doing since the doorway, since the alphabetized spice rack, since the soup she brought without being asked, and decided, finally, to just say the true thing. The way Frank had been not so subtly telling us to for over a week now. "Of this," I said, "of you. Of how much easier it's gotten to breathe around you than it has any right to be, given how we met in that conference room. I built this whole tidy story where you were the villain, and it was so much safer than the story where you're just a person I like more than I know what to do with most days." Something shifted in her face, careful and hopeful at once, like she was bracing for the sentence to have a punchline that undercut it, and slowly realizing, with visible relief, that it didn't have one at all. "I like you," she said, quiet, like the words cost her something to hand over undefended. Not in the complicated, guilty way, in the plain way. I have, I think, since the doorway, which is an absurd thing to admit, given the doorway was possibly the worst first impression in the history of first impressions between 2 people. It really was. I'm aware. "You fired me in that same voice you just used," I said, and watched her wince, and reached over, without entirely deciding to, and took her hand in mine. "I'm not bringing that up to hurt you. I'm bringing it up because I need you to know I see all of it. The version of you that signed that paperwork, and the version of you sitting on this porch right now, and I still want the second one anyway. That's not nothing. That's not small, coming from me, given everything you already know about how careful I've had to be lately." "I know," she said. and her hand tightened around mine, steady, like she'd been waiting a long time to be allowed to hold on to something. I know exactly how much that cost you. I don't take it lightly, not for 1 second. The porch light buzzed faintly overhead. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and went quiet again. And for the first time in 2 months, I let myself sit in a silence with her that didn't feel like bracing for something. It just felt, plainly and simply, like being exactly where I was supposed to be, hand in hand, on a porch that had somehow become the center of my whole world. We sat like that for a long while, not saying anything else, because for once there wasn't anything urgent left to fix or explain or apologize for between us. The evening settled in around us, ordinary and unremarkable to anyone driving past, and I remember thinking that this was exactly the kind of moment nobody ever tells you to watch for. Not the grand gesture, just two tired women on a porch step, finally choosing honesty over armor, hand in hand, with nothing left to prove to each other. Neither of us moved for a long moment, hands still joined on the step between us, and I think we both understood, without saying it, that the next thing either of us did would matter more than anything either of us had said all evening. "I'm going to do something," she said, low. "And if it's the wrong call, you can tell me, and I'll go back to holding your hand on a porch step like a teenager for as long as you need me to." That sounds like a very reasonable backup plan, honestly. One I wouldn't complain about at all. I thought so. She lifted her free hand to my face, slow, like she was giving me every opportunity to lean away if I wanted to. And I didn't want to. Not even a little. And when her palm settled against my cheek, it felt less like a first touch and more like something we'd both been circling for 6 weeks without letting ourselves name it out loud. "For what it's worth," I said, echoing her one last time. "I've wanted you to do that since the spice rack, if I'm being completely honest with you right now." That's dangerously close to a nice thing to say to me. Don't get used to it. She smiled, the real one, unguarded, the one I'd only seen a handful of times, and then she leaned in, and I met her halfway, closing the last small distance between us, without a single moment of hesitation. The kiss, when it finally happened, was nothing like the tension that had built it. It was slow, and warm, and steadying, her thumb tracing gently along my jaw, like she was memorizing something she intended to keep for a long time to come. It felt less like a spark, and more like exhaling after holding my breath for 2 months straight, like something finally settling into the exact place it had been meant for all along, quiet and certain, and entirely unhurried. When we broke apart, she rested her forehead lightly against mine for just a moment, both of us smiling in that dazed, unguarded way that has no dignity left in it, and doesn't need any at all. Not on a porch step at the end of a very long, very complicated month. "So," she said, "redemption arc?" "Absolutely not," I said. "This is a completely different story, one that's just getting started, as far as I can tell." Somewhere behind the screen door, Frank's voice carried out into the night, entirely too pleased with himself for a man who was supposed to be asleep an hour ago. "Finally," he called, not even bothering to pretend he hadn't been listening the whole time. "I've got money riding on this with my physical therapist, and now I get to collect." "Go to bed, Frank," we said, nearly in unison, laughing despite ourselves at the sheer audacity of the man. The porch light buzzed on, warm and steady, over the two of us laughing quietly into the dark, hands still loosely tangled together, neither of us in any particular hurry to let go now that we'd finally allowed ourselves to reach for each other. The night went easy and unhurried from there, the way good nights do when nothing more needs to be proven. When the hardest part is finally, blessedly, behind you instead of still waiting somewhere ahead. We stayed out there another hour, talking about nothing important, the kind of easy conversation that only happens once the big, terrifying thing has already been said and survived. At some point, Camille asked if I wanted to come by for coffee the next morning, and I told her I already had a standing arrangement with the coffee situation next door, and she said quietly that maybe it was time the arrangement expanded to include 2 cups, instead of just the one I'd been carrying alone all this time. 2 cups, I repeated, testing the shape of it. That's a big commitment for a woman who alphabetizes spice racks. I contain multitudes, she said, deadly serious, and I laughed loud enough that a light came on in a neighbor's window 2 houses down, and neither of us cared even a little. Walking home that night, I didn't feel like I was leaving anything behind on that porch. I felt, for the first time in months, like I was finally walking towards something instead of just away from it. I fell asleep that night, without a single rehearsed sentence running through my head for the first time in weeks. No arguments to win, no armor left to check before morning. Just the quiet certainty that tomorrow would start the same way it always had. Coffee, 11 steps, Frank's complaints waiting on the other side of a door. Except now, for the first time, I wouldn't be walking those steps alone. 3 months is a strange unit of time to measure a life by. But it's exactly how long it took for everything to settle into a shape I actually recognized as good, steady, and entirely mine to keep. Frank's hip healed well enough that his physical therapist cleared him for cautious, supervised mischief, his words, not mine, and he celebrated by immediately trying to reorganize his own spice rack back into its original chaos, out of pure spite, the day Camille's leave officially ended. She went back to the office 3 days a week instead of full-time, a compromise she negotiated herself. Because apparently once you've spent 3 months learning to sit with people instead of just fixing them, you don't want to lose that entirely to a boardroom again, no matter how much the job pays. I got the operations job, in the end, not through her phone call, which she never made, true to her word, but through the former colleague who'd forwarded me the listing. It came down to my own interview, my own 3 callbacks, my own merit standing entirely on its own 2 feet, without anyone pulling strings behind the scenes on my behalf. When I told Camille, she didn't offer congratulations wrapped in relief at her own absolution the way I half braced for. She just grinned, wide and unguarded, and said, I never doubted it for a second, and somehow that landed so much better than any grand gesture ever could have managed. Ruby, for her part, has adjusted to the new arrangement with the seriousness of a diplomat handling a particularly delicate treaty. She has informed Camille at length of her opinions on the color yellow, the correct way to eat a grilled cheese, and the exact rules of the scooter figure-8 course she runs in our shared driveway, which Camille now knows better than most departments she used to manage at the company that once employed us both. Last week, unprompted, Ruby asked if Camille was going to be my other mom now, and Camille looked at me over Ruby's head with an expression somewhere between panic and pure joy, and I just shrugged and said, ask me again in a year, which felt honest and hopeful, and exactly as far ahead as I was willing to plan out loud in front of a 5-year-old who takes everything I say as gospel. We still bring Frank his coffee every morning. Both of us now, together, which he pretends to tolerate and secretly adores, given that he's started making 2 extra cups worth of complaints instead of 1. Purely so, he gets double the company out of the arrangement. He still calls it his coffee, like the 11 steps between our doors were always meant to lead somewhere, like he'd been quietly building a bridge between 2 households long before either of us noticed we needed one. Some evenings, the 3 of us sit on his porch as the streetlights come on, Ruby doing figure-8s until she's called in for dinner, Frank narrating the neighborhood like a man who's appointed himself its unofficial mayor, and Camille's hand finding mine, easy now, the way it wasn't in the beginning, the way I couldn't have imagined it being on the day she opened that door in a Cubs t-shirt and turned my whole tidy, bitter little story upside down. I used to think getting fired was the worst thing that happened to me that year. Turns out it was just the door I had to walk through to find the family I didn't know I was building. 1 badly organized spice rack, 1 stubborn old man, and 1 impossible, wonderful woman at a time, none of whom I would trade now for anything the old job could have offered me in 100 spreadsheets. And if you'd told me That Tuesday morning with 2 cooling cups of coffee in my hands, that this is where it would all lead. I don't think I would have believed a single word of it. But here we are. Here we are together, on this same porch, with the same stubborn old man keeping score, and I wouldn't trade one single complicated, ridiculous step of the way that brought the 3 of us exactly here. So if there's anything I'd want you to take from all of this, it's that the worst morning of your year doesn't get the final say on how the story ends. Sometimes the door that closes on you is standing right next to the one that's about to open, and you won't know which is which until you're brave enough to keep walking those 11 steps anyway, coffee in hand, ready for whoever answers.